I think I'll introduce myself. My name is Pete Ziegler. I am a principal designer and researcher at a company called Katera, which is based out of San Francisco, California. And we are a startup that is intending to disrupt the construction industry. And it's very much about sustainability and building buildings in a completely new kind of way. And also kind of enabling a new sort of experience within the buildings. So this image here, let me take a step back actually. The human eye changes as we age, and this is mostly macular degeneration, which loosens the tendons in the eyes so that we can't quite focus as well. But one of the aspects of the eyeball that's interesting that comes with age is the yellowing of the cornea, making an image like this in the subtleties and the colors and the shifts almost impossible to differentiate. And so, you know, the character of the eyeball changes as we age. And my only point here is that for most of my career I've spent looking at the experience of aging. So this is me with one of my research participants in London Fields in London, where I spent a lot of time looking and immersing myself in cultures that I was not a part of. So I was designing for people who I am not. And I think that's an important part of what inclusion is now. The way that I would like to see the industry change, or inclusive design or universal design change, is to get more people designing for the people that they are. So, you know, she's 70 years old. I'd like to see more 70-year-old designers designing for themselves and for their cohorts. You're probably familiar with this. It's Maslow's hierarchy. Who is familiar with this? Is everybody? Okay, pretty much, like 95%. So this is a really important framework for me now in daily life. So from the bottom, we've got physiological, and then we move up, we've got safety. Then you start to change from, you know, our existence and keeping ourselves alive to things like love and belonging and esteem, which are kind of around our purpose and what satisfies us as people. And then self-actualization at the top, which is really about this sort of unreachable goal. So these are just some descriptions. We don't really need to go into them, but so at the bottom we've got survival, in the middle we've got psychological, and at the top it's sort of our reason for being, which I don't think we ever really achieve. But the point for this is that we can actually design around these things. Each one of these, you can design for physiological, safety, love and belonging, esteem. I don't think you can actually design for self-actualization. So inclusive design requires that we design for people who we aren't. And so what does that mean? It means we need to understand their experiences. And me, as someone who's specialized in aging, I spent a lot of time with people who were much older than me. But also, I think from a sort of selfish point of view, I would take their wisdom and apply it to my own life and my own understanding of what I want aging to be. These are just some basic kind of parameters for inclusion. So you've got cognitive, mobility, hearing, sight, age, economics, health, education, racial, religious, language, cultural, geographic, political, physical. You know, inclusion can work across all of these. And it's very rare that we actually just are designing or researching or thinking about one of them. So this is Betty, she's 91. And so mobility, hearing, sight, and age are four of the things that I was working with her to design around. And this is Zoya. She's a little bit younger, but she's got a different mix. So mobility, economic, language, and cultural kind of kept her from feeling included in everyday society. And so I think understanding our experiences and how we experience is really important. And so I think human beings are these amazing input-output machines. And so here on the left, we have our senses. And the senses enable us to bring the outside world in. So we have sight, hearing, listening, smell, taste, cutaneous touch, proprioceptics, which is kind of our position in space and how we relate to the larger environment. And so we use these to bring things into ourselves, into our brain, into our heart, and into our gut, where we process these signals. And we relate them to our priors from the past and our history and our upbringing and all of these other things. And that's where we sort of process these signals and then output them in the form of ideas, communications, emotions, actions, and this one's sort of confusing, transportation geography. That's more of where we are in the world, so our locations. So we can change all of these things. And you can imagine that, going back to the slide where I showed a number of different inclusive design parameters, like age, sound, hearing, sight, things like that. If you take one of these things out of this, either from input, from processing, or from output, then you can see how our experience would change quite a bit, and how we may have an opportunity to design in order to use, or an opportunity to use technology or some other kind of enabling possibility to sort of level the playing field. So this is an example from outside of design. So this is more of a historical example about the painter J.M.W. Turner, who painted a lot of these amazing seascapes. But in order to understand how to paint them, he actually had to experience them. And so he tied himself to the masts of these ships, and they would go out into the oceans, and he would understand how the ocean behaved. And he felt like he needed to do that in order to paint that image on the left. And so he almost died many, many times, and he was constantly sick from these explorations. This is another example, and I'm not sure if the first person to speak about this was Kevin Slavin from MIT Media Lab, but it's been out there in little bits and pieces. But this is, on the left, that's a Periscope operator. And so if you've ever looked through a Periscope, it flips the image upside down and backwards. And then this is just a diagram to kind of show, to depict that. But there's this myth, or kind of a legend, no one really knows if it's true, about a place called Upside Down and Backwards World, where Periscope operators from World War I would spend time living upside down and backwards to retrain their brains to be able to operate periscopes. And then this is just another really interesting example about people who've had amputated limbs, and they just use these mirrors in order to kind of solve for the sensation of ghost limbs and the pains that they feel. And so it's this visual kind of therapy that they use, in a very simple one. We're now starting to use VR for this and all kinds of things, but a simple mirror is actually all you need. So I think we all know about human-centered design, where we look at people's entire lives in order to design for them. You know, what are their goals? Who are their families? Where do they live? All these kinds of things. But let's start to break that down. So we've also got user-centered design. And this is more where you're looking specifically at a person's experience with a product, a website, an app. How do they interact with it? What are their patterns? How does it affect them specifically? Where you don't need to go out and understand, you know, what their grand ambitions are, you know, what the inside of their house looks like. Going down from there, you've got consumers, so consumer-centered design, sometimes called customer-centric. And this is not my favorite, but it is important to give some respect to customer-centric design, because we're trying to connect the right ideas to the right people. And without that, you know, a good idea not connected to the right audience is pretty useless. And then you've got benefactors. So in this case, the user is not the benefactor. The user is someone who is, for example, a parent setting up a brokerage account for their 4-year-old child. The benefactor is that child, but the user is the parent. Or in many cases, I've done a lot of work in diabetes. So in hypoglycemic situations, in emergencies, someone who is diabetic is not able to apply an injection to themselves, so they need someone else to do that. So that they would be the benefactor in that case. Now let's go out from the human perspective and look at how the human fits in to the bigger picture. So society. This is typically our geographic locations, but it's also ideas of society. It's smaller groups that we can relate to. Then you've got civilization. So civilization is sort of a moving target. Civilization, the definition of civilization is our highest potential at any one moment. So this could be technology, it could be social, it could be the way we behave or the way we evolve and use our brains. So civilization in 50 or 100 years will be different than what it is now. And you think about what was civilized 300 years ago, and that was very different. And then you've got humanity, and this is something that this has really captured my imagination, and this is all something I've been incubating for about 6 months or 8 months. But humanity-centered design is where you completely step back from individuals, and you're just looking at our existence as we live on Earth. So these are real questions now. Humanity, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about all of these, potential scary threats to our existence. And we can't, just like with self-actualization, we can't really design for that, but we can hope to. And I think the internet actually falls into either humanity or civilization. And it's getting to that point, but you couldn't have expected it to be there. So here's one project, and admittedly this is pretty old, but this is what was requested of me to present. So this is from 2012. I did this after I graduated from the Royal College of Art. And I was a researcher at the Helen Hillman Center for Design, which is located at the Royal College. So this was a partnership with the EPFL, which is a Swiss engineering university in Lausanne, which they have a very distinct interest in how their country is aging and how their country is changing because of the aging populations. And so they wanted me to investigate roughly what does that mean. They had a number of startups who were involved who were in social networking. So there was just kind of this perfect match that I would look at social networking for aging populations. But let's start here. So the world is old outside of Africa and a few places in the Middle East, and it's getting older. What does this mean for the next 50 or 100 years? I'm not sure, but what it does mean for us, designers, researchers, technologists, is that we should be looking at not necessarily only designing for people who are millennials or younger than that, but we should be looking at designing for people who are older. How can we change our expectation of how we age? So there's almost 3 billion of our 7.4 billion people on Earth are on social networks. And of course that's growing, and I don't think any of us are the slightest bit surprised by that. But there's a lot of people who are left out of that, some by choice and some by the fact that they're still not very used to how to navigate a website. And I know this because I taught classes, just general computer classes, to people who still are uncomfortable with even navigating to a website. And so when I started this project, this was my first project around aging. And so I was trying to design within this sort of campaign that would couch me from a certain perspective. And so it was designed for our future selves. And so I wanted to design with this idea that I was going to become them, And my expectation of how I'll age is that I will have problems too. I will have challenges. I won't be able to pick up things quite as quick at some point, but I'm not sure what those things are going to be. You know, part of that depends on how technology changes. Another aspect to aging is that as we age, we get more diverse. And so when we're babies, we're pretty much the same. We're born into different circumstances. We have different opportunities ahead of us. But as we grow up, we get more independence. We're able to make our own decisions. Life happens to us. All of these things make us more and more subtle and nuanced. You know, accidents can happen. Genetics can catch up with us. You know, certain diseases can rear their head. You know, we could win the lottery. Anything. And so we just get more different. And also that technology evolves much faster than we do. And this is an image from one of the classes that I taught. So when I was teaching these general technology internet classes, it was from the point of a researcher. And you won't be able to hear this, but this is Vance, he's 71, and he's describing, this is a workshop that I conducted. He's describing how social networks previously, when he was growing up, actually until pretty recently, were sort of confined to your geography, the people that you worked with, the people in the neighborhood, and so on. You know, and now all of a sudden, within, you know, much less than a decade, you're able to connect to anyone on Earth at any time, and you know the possibility is kind of limitless. And for me, I suppose, because I had internet pretty early on, that's not as big of a shift for him. And so in this workshop, I also had people sort of plotting out who their relationships were, who they trusted, who they didn't trust, who they loved, who they hated. I wanted to understand the nuances, but also the really obvious ways that people think about their relationships as they grow older. But this is really for all of us. All of this is really for all of us because, you know, we're having the same experiences. And so when looking at, one of the aspects when looking at social networks is that, I'm just realizing that I am over time already, is that, you know, we're trying to quantify our social lives by numbers. And I'm going to pick up the speed here a lot. And this is a video game that was designed by a French video game designer in 1991, and there was no score. The only reason to move through this game was not to accumulate points, but to survive. And it's got this really quiet kind of feeling and really focused feeling to it, and it's very beautiful. And it became this underground classic. This is, and then from the aspect of privacy, this is a little app that I wrote that would draw a picture of your face. And so we were looking at how the people I was talking to didn't want the pictures of themselves on the internet. And so I wrote this little piece of software that would actually draw some sort of version of themselves that they could then put up online that would be recognizable, but not so recognizable that they could be picked out on a street or anything like that. And I worked as a technology therapist, and so working with these people, we would first try and solve problems in the least invasive way, and that's just by talking through it. So a lot of the issues that they were having didn't need expensive or even inexpensive, but maybe slow design solutions, but just they needed a little bit of an adjustment in their attitude to how they approached these things. And I got a lot of quotes, both negative and positive, but this is my favorite. And I use my grandson's account. I don't trust it. And this is Betty, who I introduced you to before. She's 91, and she was, for a while, until her grandson found out, she was actually logging into Facebook using his account. And she was more comfortable with that. So there's several principles here that were really important to the designs that came out of this. One, make the positive results obvious early on to enforce correct use. And so a lot of times people wouldn't understand if they were actually using an application correctly. 2, technology should keep the people they already care about closer. And so this was, you know, in a more extreme attempt, this would actually keep the possibility of bringing new people into their virtual circles difficult in a way to actually maintain their existing relationships more. And the third is that older people want their online lives to mirror their offline lives as closely as possible, versus, you know, maybe a 12-year-old, I'm sort of taking a guess here, who may be experimenting with who they want to become with their online profiles. And I've got 4 concepts, but I'll quickly walk you through 1 or 2. So I'm going to be doing a little reading here. So the first one is the address book. And this is an address book that Libby has had for 50 years. And it's this amazing artifact. And these are the kinds of things in human-centered design that we look for. This is one of her prized possessions. So your profile on the left is exactly as you would see it on the right. Profiles are smaller and more specific to allow for straightforward scrolling and selecting, sending and receiving. It declutters your interface from all the added extras that clog up current sites. Just as with real address books, you can create an offline profile for a friend with the information you already have: phone numbers, emails, addresses, etc. This information also doubles as your invitation to them to join you online. The site is intentionally limited in functionality, becoming a tool with a more singular use. And one of the problems is the consistency between desktop applications and apps, the patterns. And so one of the ideas here was that the pattern between the desktop app and an app on the phone would be exactly the same. There would not be one single difference. Obviously, you're using a touch screen and things like that, but it would look exactly the same and work exactly the same. I'll skip this one. Okay. So the memoir. The memoir is a historic, traditional, therapeutic form of passing down one's history. So one of the people I was talking to was in the process of organizing all of these folders, which is her memoir for her life. And she told me she was preparing for her death in this process. And so the memoir takes static diaries and stories that people write about their lives, like journal entries and things, and links it in an active way to social networking. Scanning through your text, keywords are pulled out from the context of a person's life story. This application makes connections and finds relationships to the people you mention, such as school friends, first dates, or people from your street. However, it also connects your story to others, linking people with a specific and shared experience, regardless of time and place. And so it's really just going into your text and mining meaning, and then finding other people that have a similar story or similar meaning. Feel free to email me or write me or ask me any questions after this, and that's all I've got for now. Thank you.